Hi, welcome to Full Scottish. I think it's fair to say that this is probably the first show that we've actually got started at the right time without any technical problems, so we're on to a flyer here. Unfortunately, my co-host Michelle Rogers is ill today, so she won't be joining us, but we do, however, have an action-packed show. We're going to kick off with our normal paper review, and joining me for that is Joyce McMillan, who's a columnist and theatre critic for The Scotsman, a political and social commentator. A collection of her theatre reviews since 1982 is just about to be published on the 30th of June. It's called Theatre of Scotland, Field of Dreams. She will be joined by Jan Patience, who's a journalist and PR writer, regular columnist with the Herald, and co-author of the recently published biography of George Wiley, which is called Arrivals and Sailings, The Making of George Wiley. It was co-written by Louise Wiley, who's George's daughter. And we've also got Joan McAlpine, who is List MSP for South of Scotland, SNP MSP for South of Scotland, Daily Record columnist and convener of the cross-party group on culture at Holyrood. So welcome all. I'll give you a brief look at some of the front pages. No prizes for guessing which story dominates the front pages today. It's Muhammad Ali. Pretty much every front page is covered with amazing pictures of him. Some of them, most papers have got big supplements as well, so it's an incredible array of front pages. This is if you can see it, the Sunday Herald. This is a supplement by the Sunday Times. This is my favourite, I guess. It's absolutely unbelievably lavish, fantastic photography. The Sunday Times front page is this one, and it goes on. The Sunday Post there, and Sunday Telegraph. This alone among the papers really is the Mail on Sunday, the Scottish Mail on Sunday, which has an anti-SNP story. Surprise, surprise, on its front, which is Liam Fee, care boss, got a top job, and there's some more stories inside there, particularly about the named person legislation and the Tories' attempt to derail that and get it scuppered. So we will start though with Muhammad Ali, and I guess the role of what is, Jan, what do you think the role of a paper is when it's coming up with a major story like this, but which people pretty much already know before they open the paper?
Well, I think it's plays a sort of magazine role really. It's all about the words and pictures, and I think David Pratt said earlier, it's a picture editor's dream. Because there's so many fantastic pictures of Muhammad Ali, black and white pictures, which show him in his prime, dancing around, with this incredible charisma. I was watching him on telly last night, the documentary, and the man was just sort of like, he kind of worked himself up into this kind of just an amazing rant about life. He was just full of life. It was great to see, and I think the papers, particularly when you pick out the Telegraph, the Observer has a lovely picture in the front with him, sort of after a fight, he's all sweating, and that's the way. I think that was what Ali kind of started off quiet and just built up, and that really summed him up, I think.
There was a quote by Prince, which was republished after his death, which kind of sums up Muhammad Ali as well. And Prince said, "Most people are born dead. I was born alive," and I think definitely Muhammad Ali was a life force. Joyce, what do you think of the way the papers have covered it today?
Well, I think it's a gift to the Sunday papers as it happens. The timing of this very sad loss of a great hero for so many people, and I think Jan's right. Everyone already knows the news about Ali's death. So what the Sunday papers can do is use pictures in a particularly powerful way, and you've been able to see that from the front covers and so on. But also to get really great writers, and of course the great big piece by Hugh McIlvanney, I think that's in the Observer.
Yes,
and great writers like that. There's a very good piece by Martin Hannon actually in Scotland on Sunday. They haven't got as much coverage obviously as the big UK papers have, but they do have one fine analytical piece, and it's really about that. It's the same sort of art as writing a very good obituary. It's analysing why someone caught the public imagination, and the Sunday papers, given the timing of Ali's death on Friday night, have just had time to do that.
Joan, you worked in newspapers, particularly the Herald. What's the atmosphere like in the newsroom when you're working on a story like this?
This is slightly different from if a story was breaking in a daily newspaper, because obviously this story broke 24 hours before the Sunday paper is published. So then the challenge is, how do you make it fresh? How do you commemorate what is the life of an extraordinary person? What struck me was when the news broke very early yesterday morning, a lot of people were doing their own editorialising on Twitter.
That's true.
They were taking these pictures are all available on the internet, and I know I did it myself. You take a beautiful picture of Ali and your own favourite quote, because there are so many fantastic quotes from Ali on all sorts of things. So I think when you move 24 hours later, what are the papers going to offer? And I think in an occasion like this, people want something tangible. They've already done their Twitter feeds and the internet stuff. They want something tangible to keep. And that the very few occasions where that applies to newspapers, and I think this is one of them. And I think the Sunday Times has probably done it best, because that Sunday Times cover, if I can pick it up again, does look like a commemorative edition. It is something that you would put in the drawer and keep, because it's one of those moments in time. And it helps if you've got fantastic graphic designers on your newspaper, and if you're confident, and I think that is by far the most confident front cover. Some of the other papers, sadly, weren't so confident, and they still felt the need to sell all the other stories in the paper, and it meant that they didn't have those poster front pages, which you really need for an occasion like this.
I mean, one of the things about Muhammad Ali was that at the time, I guess what annoys me sometimes about coverage of a celebrity like him when he dies is that there is then this kind of uniformity of opinion on what the person meant, and therefore we are now expected to believe that Muhammad Ali was beloved at the time. I'm old enough to remember him when he was younger, and he was not beloved at that time. Can you remember? There were people who believed him to be divisive. There were people, particularly when he joined the Nation of Islam. That was not a popular move.
No.
When he criticised the Vietnam War, not a popular move.
No, at the time, he was vilified, and sort of taken away from boxing officially for 3 years.
3 years.
So, I'm obviously not a fan of boxing, but I remember watching him in Parkinson in the 70s, and this incredible figure, that he seemed to kind of change over the years as he appeared. The last appearance was quite, obviously Parkinson was setting in, but yeah, I think I agree. But like all public figures, like all the people that have died recently, Bowie, he went through the same thing, the kind of ups and downs of sort of popularity when you are a public figure. So now is the time to be looking at him in the way he was.
I think it's important to remember, I think in the time that you're talking about, that period in the 60s and 70s, I think the attitude to him in the UK was completely different to the attitude to him in the United States. I think in the United States, which was still a very divided country and remains a very divided country in terms of race, there were people who vilified him. I think in the UK he had a completely different reception.
Well, in all of the Scottish papers, they have all put a kilt on it, because Ali obviously liked to come to Scotland, and they rolled out the pipers and all the rest of it.
The Coatbridge Ladies Pipers, which is used to be. I was really.
That was a detail that escaped me when I was reading.
I noticed
you were talking about
on Twitter yesterday, Alan McCready, the photographer who worked in Waterstones in Edinburgh at the time when Ali came to do a famous book signing there. Must have been about 20 years ago or round about that, I think. And he had he just put his recollection on Twitter in 3 or 4 tweets, and he said that he gave the extraordinary impression when he came into the shop of actually glowing as if he was made of gold, and he's really not the kind of he's not the kind of person who would exaggerate in that sort of way. So I thought that was a really striking phrase, and he said a lot of people in the crowd in Waterstones that day were just moved to tears by seeing him in the flesh. So he really meant a great deal to people. But I'm old enough, sadly, to remember his fighting heyday, and I remember the dismissive tone in which he was often spoken about by people like Harry Carpenter, the legendary British boxing commentator. They talked about him as if he was a pretty boy who couldn't really fight. And then when he began to say politically controversial things, they really talked about him in quite a hostile way. And I'm old enough to remember that. And people would argue about whether he was really a serious fighter or not, or just a kind of mouthy, star that didn't really have the chops as far as actually fighting was concerned. And it was only when he kind of matured, won his title back again for the second time, and then, of course, was struck by this awful Parkinson's at really quite an early age, before he even gave up fighting completely. Then he began to acquire this kind of gravitas of a sort of figure that everyone admired. But that certainly wasn't the case when he was a young fighter at the height of his powers. People were extremely ambivalent about him, and the British establishment was too, although I think he was very popular with the people.
He was very popular with people.
I think what worries me about the sort of lionisation in this way is that there's an assumption that the battle is won and the good guys were victorious. Well, the battle is not won, and if it had been won, it wouldn't have been won by the good guys. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we shouldn't be complacent about it. And I think there's a bit of I don't know, I feel a bit reluctant to talk about it. It's a bit of a backslapping. Aren't we so liberal now?
Yes. I mean, I think that's true of a lot of the stars of the 60s that are beginning to leave us now. I mean, people talk as if Bowie was always an uncontroversial and much loved and greatly admired genius. And I mean, Bowie was such a controversial figure throughout most of his career. A lot of people thought at various different times for different reasons that the work he was doing was absolute rubbish. But they don't say that now, And it seems to me that it's kind of in the nature of the 60s as a decade that it threw up a lot of really radical figures who were in various ways disparaged, underrated, and so on at the time. And then now that they're reaching the age where they can, pass into the next world and have, in a sense, lost the power, or at least seem to have lost the power to change things in the way that they did when they were alive, then everybody rallies behind them and says, oh yes, it was absolutely wonderful. And the very scale of the coverage of some of the deaths that we've had this year has been controversial, and you really do sometimes wonder if it isn't just a way of avoiding actually addressing the issues that these people tried to address in their lives. With Ali, it was the great issue of race in America, race in the world, and of course with Bowie there was a hugely controversial transgender thing which he completely brought to life for a whole generation of people. But I mean, it wasn't exactly uncontroversial at the time.
No. I mean, the thing that Ali said about he didn't have any truck with the Viet Cong, now, with the benefit of hindsight and history, you can say, well, that is absolutely spot on.
The thing his argument was, I've never been racially abused by a Viet Cong. Exactly, which clearly is true.
And I think that is interesting about when these people die, it's an opportunity to look back at recent history and see where they fit in and where how we've shaped history also.
I think one of the other things that's been mentioned is that could a figure like Ali, a sports star, emerge today when sports stars are so carefully marketed and packaged? Someone who had that resonance beyond sport into politics and the wider world.
Look at Andy Murray, who came out saying he vote yes towards the end of the Indy ref, and he was
vilified, and he didn't even feel he could say it apart from a tweet after the polls. It was really rather oblique.
By the way,
that's a really good example.
Yeah. What do you think about the paper's ability to print, which is supposed to be dead, versus internet in terms of covering something like this? You mentioned, Joan, people like to have something. I remember after 9/11, the news. My memories of 9/11 are all paper front pages. Maybe that's just me, but I just remember. Well, I never remember what a website looked like. I mean, I'm sure websites serve a big purpose, but they don't sum up a moment for me. Do you think print does that in a way that is more long lasting?
If it does it well, yes. Now, if print doesn't have a future as in terms of the daily newspaper 20 years time, I think there will still be people want something tangible. It might not be in newspaper form, but I think that there will be a demand on occasions like this for something that you can hold in your hand and keep.
Yep. Moving on to the story which knocked Ali off the main slot in the front page in the Mail on Sunday in Scotland, which is the Liam Fee, the tragic case of Liam Fee. And their story is really about the guy who was in charge of the social work department in that area getting a top job. But inside the paper as well, there's news of a Conservative attempt to stop the named person legislation, which is admittedly, I think, Joan, would you agree it's controversial?
I think certain people through misinformation have tried to politicise it, and I think it's absolutely disgusting that they've tried to politicise it on the back of this little boy's death. I was on the Education Committee when this legislation was passed, and I think it's important to say it was one small piece of the Children and Young People's Act in 2014, which did a lot of fantastic stuff in terms of giving care leavers, for example, additional support right up until they're 25, and all sorts of other different things. If I've got one regret, it's calling this named person, because it gives it a status, and a kind of it gives it a status that it actually doesn't merit, in the sense that this is not a huge change. This is a continuation of a common sense approach to child protection, which means that if there's a threat to a child's well-being, then the person who is their point of contact, either a head teacher, a guidance teacher, or in the case of an under 5, a health visitor, would feel confident to share that information. A lot of the cases in the past where young children have fallen through the net is because that information wasn't shared at an early stage. That's all this is, it's a point of contact. So, I guess if I had one regret, that we didn't call it a point of contact instead of a named person, which suggests that we're bringing in something new. I mean, wouldn't you expect a health visitor to share information if she thought there was a threat to the child's well-being? Wouldn't you expect a head teacher to do the same? That's all this is. And the Conservative Party and some, extreme religious groups have used this as a way to attack the government, and I think it's pretty despicable.
Joyce, what's your views on the named persons legislation?
Well, I'm really not an expert in the field of child protection, but my impression is that it's rather the same as Joan's, in the sense that I think this scheme has been very badly explained and badly named in a way that has put the wind up a lot of people, and it's certainly made it very easy for groups that are opposed to it to portray it to parents as being some kind of gross interference in their parenting of their children. Although paradoxically, when cases like Liam Fee happen, the argument is always that there hasn't been enough interference. So it's actually quite an ambivalent argument that the opponents of this scheme are making. So, I wouldn't claim to be a huge expert in it, but my broad impression is that what Joan says is true, in that all of the groups that are now, not all of the groups, but all the political parties that are now opposing it were quite keen on this idea at one stage.
They all voted for
certainly
it.
Labour was. I don't know what the history of the Conservatives
The Conservatives
on this.
always opposed it.
Yeah,
but that based on the premise that,
Yeah.
there are some children that could never be abused because they're middle-class children, and middle-class children are never abused. This is actually where this is operated, and it was already operating long before the legislation was passed. I believe that the surveys of it show that it's actually led to a decrease in the work of social services, because it's about early intervention. If there's a problem affecting children, so it takes them out of the net of social services. If you feel that the only way that if you've got a concern about a child, the only way that you can act on that is to report them to social services, that is far more of an interference in terms of the family, and it also puts a bigger burden on social services. If you've just got an uneasy feeling as a professional, you can then share that with other professionals. It could be that there's a problem that you can solve at an early stage by giving that family more support, and the vast majority of families won't be affected, because most health visitors and head teachers and guidance teachers are far too busy to interfere in the lives of most families. It's only when there's a threat to the child's well-being.
Absolutely tragic to this case. I mean, to kind of leap on it, I think, because there was intervention in this case, because it was reported by several people, including the child's nursery. And then, but you just get bad people who, that mother took the child out of the playgroup. And,
Yeah.
and then the social worker went off sick. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that concerns me is that the argument about the named person legislation, which is really the named person aspect of the legislation, which is really just about a point of contact and about a more coherent way of alerting services to any possible problem, might distract attention from actually analysing what's wrong with the services. I mean, it was quite clear that the Liam Fee case did kind of drop off the desk because apparently the key social worker involved with this case went sick. And you know, you really have to ask yourself what happened to the management system there. Well, if a case with an alert on it like that couldn't be dealt with. But that's nothing to do with named person. And I do think the effort to immediately turn the death of Liam Fee into a political stick to beat this particular piece of legislation with it is really quite distasteful. I mean, I don't say that lightly, because I think people have got a right to make points, and if they think that something that happens shows a weakness in legislation, then they've got a perfect right to say so. But the speed with which this has leapt to a discussion about named person instead of a discussion about the pressures on social services and why that case wasn't taken up by another social worker at the time of the sick leave, is really worrying. That we're not discussing what the real problem is.
They bring that up in the Mail on Sunday about the cuts in the social services in Fife. So I mean, there is obviously a problem there. You know?
Yes.
As a PR exercise, though, do you think the legislation has been?
No, I think. Well, I mean, I can only speak from personal experience, but I've been sitting on parent councils for a number of years, and this getting it right for every child has been talked about for a long time. And then now it's out in the sort of the public domain. And you know, my father-in-law, for example, who is absolutely aghast and agitated about it, and thinks I should be too. But I've tried to explain that I don't think it's that much of an intervention. I think it's a good thing. But and I think he's in that camp of it's not got past the headline.
Well, if you've read in the newspaper that you're going to be told what colour to paint your child's bedroom and nonsense like that, it's absolute nonsense.
I remember there was one paper had a story about somebody being reported because their child picked her nose or something, but the story went on to explain that was a mistake, and nothing happened as a result of that. It was just an overzealous person, which can happen anyway. In terms of PR disasters or PR exercises, let's go and turn to Europe and the European referendum campaigns. Some of the stories in the papers today, pardon me, Michael Gove saying that you can't trust David Cameron, surprise, surprise. Whether you can trust Michael Gove or not remains to be seen. But yes, I think one of the most interesting parts of the developments in the story is the fact that Boris Johnson is now going to face two Scottish politicians in debates, one with Davidson in a kind of blue-on-blue debate, the other Nicola Sturgeon as part of a panel discussion on it. I guess, do you think, Joyce, that Nicola Sturgeon was right to agree to take part in this debate?
Yes, on balance. I think it will be good to hear a different voice from David Cameron's, because, I mean, the problem with David Cameron at this stage in his premiership is that a lot of people have a lot of reasons to dislike him. Therefore, in a sense, his very presence at the head of the Remain campaign gives the Brexiteers a stick to beat the Remain campaign with. So in that sense, having the Remain argument articulated by someone who is not David Cameron, and for most of the UK population doesn't carry that sort of baggage, will be a good thing. I'm not sure, and I really don't know, how sharp Nicola's arguments will be on the day, because it seems to me that the SNP have taken their pro-Europe position for granted for a long time. You see, Jim Sillars is getting a bit of play in some of the papers today for his anti-EU position. And it seems to me that the assumption that Scotland will vote to remain, and the assumption that the SNP kind of knows why it's in favour of the EU has to be pretty carefully examined under this sort of pressure. So I hope, she'll have the time and the energy to really develop the arguments properly and make sure that she can really win that debate against Boris. But if she does, then I think it will be a good thing that she'll have done. Jan,
are you completely enthused by this European debate we're having? Are you engaged in?
Yes, I am. I mean, it's interesting, and obviously there's a sort of a north-south divide on it all as well. I think what we're talking about here is completely different from what's been talked about down south. I mean, I read the Observer poll, and it didn't mention the Observer poll this morning is saying it's 47 for out, 43.
That's-
Well, that's not right. My maths is wrong, but I've got to have it. Yeah, 40% for Remain, 43 for Leave, but not mentioning Scotland in that mix.
No.
But I mean, they're very.
Is that a UK?
That's
figure?
a UK
It's
figure.
a UK figure. There's Scottish figures within, although we don't know how
Well,
many
didn't
people in
actually
Scotland they
mention
asked. No.
the breakdown
Absolutely.
of Scotland, but yeah, I think immigration's become the issue that they're focusing on, and that's sort of not so much up here. But I think it'll be interesting. I saw the piece in the Telegraph was good about Michael Gove's family fish business. That's sort of bringing it up to the northeast a little bit. You know, the misery of
the Sunday
family fish
Times have
business.
got interviews with Gove, and they've got one with Osborne, which is the first interview I think with Osborne with this campaign. I left it a bit late. I'm wondering whether. Is it true to say that not much has happened, Joan, in terms of the campaign other than leafleting and doorstepping? I think I expected more.
Well, we objected to the timing of the campaign in the first place because it was so close to the Scottish Parliament elections. So it is probably true to say that there hasn't been a great deal of campaigning, and a lot of people aren't particularly engaged with the debate. From my point of view, I feel that in Scotland we are putting the positive case to Remain, but I think the question that needs to be asked is, if we did come out, the money that we currently get from the EU will go straight to Westminster. And the idea of a Conservative government passing that money on to Scotland, if you obviously represent in a rural area, south of Scotland is a very rural area, agriculture is the mainstay of the economy. It supports lots of other jobs and lots of other industries, seed merchants, fencers, machinery suppliers, anything that you could name is supported by agriculture. 1 in 3 farms will go under in Scotland, we know that, if they don't get these farm payments. There's also rural development payments that maintain very fragile rural communities. Now, if that money goes to London, not as much of it will go there as Boris suggests, but we'll get some of it back. They will not pass it on because they've already failed to pass on certain payments to Scotland, to our rural economy. So representing a rural area, that's my chief concern, and I think probably we need to talk more about that. Because whatever happens, we know it's going to be close, and there's going to be a big division in the English Conservative Party, and what the implications of that are for us going forward, I think are very serious.
Okay, from one big decision to another, because democracy just keeps on happening. The American elections, Donald Trump is now the official candidate for the Republicans. I'd like to welcome to the show David Pratt, who's contributing foreign editor for the Sunday Herald. So, President
Good
Trump.
afternoon.
Hello, President Trump. What's going to happen?
Oh God, you ask me that every week, Richard.
I know.
And I
You
get,
never tell me.
And I get increasingly kind of terrified as it every week passes, as I'm sure many people do. I think what's interesting is that at the moment, obviously Trump is in a very good position because, you know, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are still fighting out the Democratic nomination. Now, inevitably, that benefits Trump at the moment. He can stay utterly focused on his own campaign, and that's reflected in the polls quite a bit. I think he's had a bit of a bounce. The last 5 surveys, I think, in the United States are showing that there's only like 2% difference now between Clinton and Trump. Clinton in the ascendancy, obviously, but that's accounting for the bounce that he's had, focused singularly on the nomination. We've also got some big events coming up. Of course, you've got obviously New Jersey and California next week, crucially for Hillary Clinton, who's invested an enormous amount of political energy, money, campaigning sort of energy into California. And the polls there are looking a little bit squeaky for her as well. You know, there's a tiny margin in California. And obviously, if she lost California, that would be a big dent in her campaign. But all of this at the moment, cumulatively, I think, is sort of quite corrosive on the Democrats. You know, this internal fighting, this internal civil war. And that's allowing, you know, obviously Trump to remain focused at this particular point in time.
I think one of the papers today had a report that while Saunders and Trump are attracting like thousands, 2,000 people to events, Hillary Clinton managed 200. And I don't know whether those events were comparable, but there's certainly a suggestion that she's not Mrs. Popular.
No, she's not. I mean, as I've said in the programme before, she carries enormous political baggage. There's the email security issue. As I mentioned before, there's Benghazi. There's the whole Clinton legacy, you know, the perception of her. There's a lot of detractors within the Democrat Party, you know, towards her in that way. And it's the sort of trade-off, the horse trading within the Democrats is going to prove crucial over the next couple of weeks. And indeed, you know, if she gets the nomination, which presumably she will, it'll be very curious to see what sort of Bernie Sanders actually wants in terms of his endorsement of that. I mean, you know, there is an argument that, you know, years down the line, Sanders is laying the legacy, I suppose, for a new kind of bedrock of Democrat politics within the United States. And that's certainly one of the positive aspects that's come out of this campaign. But it was curious, I mean, you were talking in the paper review earlier on about the Muhammad Ali death at the moment. And it would be interesting, you know, I think if they hadn't been wrapped up in this fighting, you know, they may have turned, their campaigning team may have turned their guns a little bit more effectively on Trump, who, you know, when you think about it, his comments about Muslims, about Muslim sports people and whatever, have been very, very negative in the past. And I'm amazed thus far, perhaps it's early days given that we've just had Muhammad Ali's death, the Democrats haven't made more of that. Perhaps over the next week or so we'll see that happening.
Well, he'll be here. Trump will be in Scotland soon.
Yes, yeah, joy of joys. Yes.
Maybe he'll come on the show.
Joy of joys. That would
invite him.
That would
Donald,
be.
you're
That would be.
watching. Come on.
So Donald comes on the show. That would be amazing.
Yeah, indeed. You are writing in the Sunday Herald today?
I am. I mean, the other story of the week for me, which in some ways I think probably bypassed a lot of people, is this incredible spat between Turkey and Germany over the German Bundestag, the lower house of the parliament's decision that to call the Armenian massacre, the Turkish massacre of Armenians in 1915 genocide. Now, as you know, there's something like 20 odd countries in the world who've recognised it as a genocide, and the jury's out in a variety of arenas. Many scholars say it is, some scholars say it isn't. But clearly the timing of this could not have been worse in terms of relations between Ankara and Berlin. For Angela Merkel, it's been a bit of a diplomatic car crash in many ways, you know. And it was interesting that she was actually absent, you know, sort of suggesting that she had prior engagements and wasn't actually at the vote in the Bundestag itself. And it was an overwhelming vote by the German parliament saying that it was genocide. Now, obviously, this has riled the Turks something awful. I mean, as I'm sure many of the viewers know, but just to remind those who don't, clearly in Turkey it's tantamount to blasphemy to say that it was a genocide against the Armenians in 1915. Indeed, it's regarded as un-Turkish. There's laws that actually prevent you actually commenting on it or calling it genocide. I mean, there's many artists, writers, Orhan Pamuk, for example, has been heavily criticised for making these remarks in the past. And the war of words has been absolutely colossal between the two. But what's interesting about it, I think, is the way in which other parties within both camps, both the German and Turkish camps, have stepped up to the plate quickly and began to try and calm things down very rapidly. Because remember, at the core of this debate is this whole deal on Europe over the idea of free visa access for Turks into Europe, you know, the support that Europe's giving, or Germany's giving especially, for Turkey in terms of financial support over refugees and whatever. That's what lies at the base of this. So I suspect, you know, that old German phrase and sort of strategy politically, realpolitik, is what will play out actually over this. So it's been a tremendous bluster between the two, but realpolitik will prevail, I think, undoubtedly.
Okay, right there, thanks for that. And the rest of the show we're spending on culture, but before we do that, I'd like to welcome to the show Joy Dunlop, who is a Gaelic singer, teacher and TV presenter and journalist. And Joy is going to sing for us today. Joy, what are you going to sing?
Well, I thought I'd sing a Gaelic song called Grag Gal Mochri. This is an old traditional love song, and for anybody that knows Eriskay Love Lilt, it was actually based on this song, so this is a traditional tune that follows the same story.
Excellent. Well, you take it away just now, and then once you are finished, we will invite two other people to join us for a roundtable discussion on culture in Scotland and where we are with it today. Thank you.
If me off her wall, if me off her wall, if me off her wall, smee for fran, gami Shimmer gai heliuch sword Gaf me course me lam hin Gusandranik mission patch Barn rockerach gaf mochedi Fydd mi o Fydd mi o Fydd mi o Smi ffofron stugami Get nach hele sin je haast post Am I noch asgami At se vabes mogarorn Chavi lon orni Fydd mi o Fydd mi o Fydd mi o Smi ffofron stugami Ac y sil y tiach mahwl Ac y dwysach mochri Ac y tanner was manuag Sŵc y grwag bar machi Fydd mi o Fydd mi o Fydd mi o Smi ffofron stugami
Thanks very much, Joy.
That knocks your choir efforts into a cocked hat, Mr. Walker, I have to say.
The show is not all about me. I'd like to invite two more guests to join us just now. First of all, Peter Arnott, who's a playwright, a writer of at least 40 plays, and he's also a novelist. He's just published his first novel, Moon Country.
That's right, yes.
And also Alan Morrison, and is a former group arts editor at the Herald and Times Group. And he is incoming head of music at Creative Scotland, although not yet taking up that role. So, welcome everybody. I guess kick it off, the discussion, with Scottish Government has in its manifesto pledged to produce a cultural strategy for Scotland. Joan, I'm going to give this one to you. Why? Why do we need that?
Well, there has been a lot of lobbying on the part of the cultural community for a cultural strategy. It's not supported by everyone. I myself and Jean Urquhart set up the cross-party group on culture in the Scottish Parliament a few years ago in order to provide a forum for the cultural community to get into the Parliament and to talk about the things that matter to it, because there's not a great deal of space within the committee structure to talk about culture. So that's one of the reasons Jean and I formed a cross-party group, and a cultural strategy was something that kept coming up in those discussions. And there was a campaign called Culture Counts, which was very much focused on getting a cultural strategy in place. In the SNP manifesto, we have now signed up to that, and there are going to be 3 strands to it. A commitment to excellence, access and equality. So obviously we're waiting to see the details of that, but I think it's very interesting. I know that Joyce has been involved in drawing up cultural strategies in the past. I think those who were resistant to it don't want culture bureaucratised, would that be right to say, or politicised? But at the same time, there is a feeling that culture is so important to the country's well-being, for example, and our success, that it actually should run through everything that we do, and I think that's the reason why the government's being persuaded to go down this road.
Well, in some ways you're preaching to the converted, John, because I'm one of those people who I like a strategy. I like to have specific targets set, but mainly for the reason that I think that we did go through at the beginning of the Scottish Parliament. There was a period of we were consulted out the bahookie, basically, and there were huge numbers of consultations, which ended up with, of course, the creation of Creative Scotland, but there was some very interesting things which I think got somewhat lost in the mountains of paper that got produced at the time, but which were to do with what are the fundamental principles and there was an idea that came about. I mean, I don't know if it living memory when Jack McConnell was First Minister. And he made a speech. We think it was in autumn 2003. Joyce and I were conferring about this, and I think it was autumn 2003. But when he made a speech on St Andrew's Day, which was to do with the idea of cultural entitlement, that each citizen of Scotland has a cultural entitlement to access to culture, access to the making of culture, as well as the consumption, as it were, of culture. And I was reminded of this week by an announcement from the Scottish Government that it is being set as partly because of the enormous success of theatre for young people and for children, by the Imaginate Festival, companies like Catherine Wales, that the idea is that it looks like an entitlement. Every primary school child in Scotland will get to take part, witness some performance once a year. And they think, it's a minimum. That's a minimum entitlement. And I think there's the beginning, I hope, of a revival but a revival on first principles of what we should expect if we have government support for the arts. What does that mean? How does that serve the public? In a sense, those kind of fundamental questions, which I know we were all but very fed up being asked those questions in the early days of the Parliament, when so much of the Parliament was dysfunctional in so many ways. That in a way it's gone out of fashion. It's also gone out of fashion because we've been living under siege. I mean, governments have been living under siege, local authorities have been living under siege since 2008. There hasn't been any spare cash in the kitty. There still isn't. And I find it enormously encouraging that even in the outline terms that you've put forward just now, that there is the idea of let's look at what the sector can do and can do better, because there's an awful lot that could be done better, in my view.
Joyce, does that mean a cultural strategy involves getting artists and putting them under the spotlight and says, well, what are you doing for the country?
Well, I don't think it's so much the individual artists. I think it's the structures, the big companies, and the things like a touring structure or the lack of a touring structure within which they work. I mean, in the field that Peter and I work in most, which is theatre. I mean, I'm a theatre critic and I'm out at the theatre in Scotland 4 or 5 nights every week. There has been a continuing debate about what's happened to the touring structure since the end of the kind of legendary touring companies of the 1970s and 80s, 784 and Wildcat. There is still a fair bit of touring goes on, but it often lacks coherence. A lot of it is actually done by the children's companies,
yes,
rather than by a kind of healthy mix of companies for younger people and grown-up companies. A lot of tours are rather short compared with what they would have been back then, so they just do maybe 3 or 4 or 5 dates around bigger theatres. They don't reach into the smaller communities, which of course was the great mission of Wildcat in 784. And then there are occasional companies that do that, but without the accompanying really strong ideological framework, which made that phase of touring in Scotland, people knew what it was about, people knew why those companies were trying to do it. Leaders like David McLennan and John McGrath were really brilliant at articulating why it was important to take theatre to all these communities, and in particular forms, and not just in conventional forms, to have these communities influencing the way the work was done, the texture of the work, the content of the work. So there's a kind of feeling that something's been lost there. So that's one aspect of the infrastructure that could be better. There are also just whole issues about a kind of awareness and marketing in Scottish theatre, which the decline of the print media doesn't help with, because, you know, every year in every way the capacity of the Herald and the Scotsman as the two sort of so-called national newspapers in Scotland to cover the art scene in Scotland diminishes. There are fewer reviews published, and how can the whole scene respond to that? Obviously you can use social media to publicise arts events, but how do you do that in a way that captures a national audience and really contributes to a national debate in the way that a review or a discussion in a national newspaper might traditionally have done? That's a big question. It was very powerfully raised by Laurie Sansom, the outgoing director of the National Theatre of Scotland, in his evidence to your committee, I think, Joan, that in the absence of that kind of powerful national media, or in that transitional phase for national media, how can the arts scene really be debated, and how can the profile of it really be raised? Because there's great work done, and I am continuously shocked by the amount of it that people outside the narrow circle of that particular art form are completely unaware of it. And there's a whole problem there.
In terms of music, I mean, the music scene in Scotland is incredibly vital just now, incredibly diverse. Alan, you started in the Sunday Herald an annual feature, which was the Scottish Albums of the Year, and there are also the Scottish Album of the Year Awards, which is a separate thing, nothing to do with the Sunday Herald. And I think the long list of that has been published, and the voting for to get it down to a short list takes place later this month. What was your thought? What was your thinking behind you starting it in the Sunday Herald?
Well, my thing was a top 50 Scottish albums of the year, and there was two things I wanted to bring to that. I got very frustrated that when it came to the end of any calendar year, you would look in magazines like Uncut, Mojo, you would look at newspapers like The Guardian, and they would do the top 50 albums of the year, which would be international, but your only way that a Scottish band would be mentioned on those lists if you were signed to a London label. So if you were Franz Ferdinand and you were on Domino, you would have a chance of getting in there. If you were on any of the fantastic labels that operate from Scotland, Chemical Underground, Lost Map, Olive Grove, you weren't really getting a look in because the critics down there weren't listening to that music. And up here, I was hearing everything internationally and everything that was coming out of London-based labels, but I was also hearing what I thought was a stronger, more diverse set of music that was coming from Scotland. So I wanted to give the exposure to that, but also I wanted to really fly the flag for the pure diversity of music. I wanted to do a top 50 albums that would put Low beside the Dunedin Consort, beside a hip-hop band like Hector Berserk, beside a singer-songwriter like Dean Owens, and just go, look, the whole spread of what we're doing up here is fantastic. And so, yeah, I was doing that for 4 years. I've had, you know, obviously it was my personal taste because it wasn't done with a panel. So first year Corinne Paul won it, second year Churches won it, third year Withered Hand, fourth year Low. So it had that diversity, my stamp of approval on it. But the Scottish Album of the Year Awards, which is the separate thing that celebrates the albums as well, that has now got a little bit of purchase, and I think it's a far better list they come up with than, say, the Mercury was. You know, it covers wider ground, it covers mainstream taste, but it also covers great experimentation as well. So at the moment, yes, 100 nominees have chosen their favourite albums. You pick your 5 albums and you do it, 10 points to your first one, 8 points to your second one. And 119 albums came out of those 100 people. The top rated ones were the 20 we have now. Next week, from the 13th to the 15th, Monday to Wednesday, the public can vote from the 20 for their favourite album, which will go forward to the final 10 shortlist, and the judging panel will pick the other 9 on that shortlist, and then on Wednesday 29th of June, down in Paisley, the winner will be announced.
Joe, you're a singer who concentrates largely on traditional music and largely on Gaelic music.
Yep.
That scene seems to me to be very on the up just now, largely because of Celtic Connections and the huge success of that globally, really. How your purpose in singing Gaelic songs, how much is it to promote the language, and how much just because it's good music?
I think in some ways it's horses for courses. It's why you're doing it for what time. I mean, I sing because I love singing, and I sing Gaelic music because I think the material is phenomenal. And what I think nowadays maybe the difference is, there was a time where Gaelic singers would sing in village halls, and you sung in the community because that's how you learned your songs, and that was your target audience. What I think is wonderful now is our target audience is the world. The internet is fabulous, and I think that now, yeah, I sing because I love singing, but actually now I'm lucky that I have a global audience, and festivals like Celtic Connections give us a platform, and that's really important. And what I think is really interesting now is you're seeing a wider appreciation for not only Gaelic music, but for traditional music, for folk music. And I'm really heartened when I look at things like the Scottish Album of the Year Awards, that there are folk records in there.
Yeah, there are.
That's wonderful. I mean, I was sitting listening. I did no work the other day because I sat and listened to everything that was on their website, but I was pretending to actually do some work. And I loved the diversity. I stopped. I wasn't doing anything because I was just listening to the change, and every time you'd go to the next song was something different. And I think the Scottish music scene is phenomenal because of that. We're really lucky that you can have all these different types of music, and they're not looked down on anymore. I think that actually traditional music and folk music is up there with pop music, with indie music, with classical music, and in Scotland in particular, I feel just that we are very, very fortunate to be in that situation.
In the wider arts world in Scotland, it seems to me there's things going on everywhere. I know there's Expo North, which starts next week, I think, which is one of the huge events for creative industries taking place up north. Jan, the health of the arts world in Scotland, if it's so healthy and so great, well, why do we need a cultural strategy for it?
It's always good to have a strategy.
Well, yeah, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of pulls it all together, to be honest. I think when you're sitting around this table, the diversity of what's available, music, visual art, which I write about, stage, I mean, it's phenomenal. And I mean, I had a conversation with Pauline McLean, the BBC arts correspondent, the other week about just how much is going on, and how she finds that it's like she could be working at 24 hours a day, because it's not just stuff, it's good stuff, And we actually at Expo North, we have a panel which Alan's on state of the arts. I think there is a big problem. It's all about writing about the arts, and I think we have a problem now because Joyce has got this book coming out of all her, the pick of your crits. I mean, the arts needs writers. They need journalists to actually articulate what is being seen and what's...
You need to pay them.
So, exactly,
Yeah.
but
Well,
that is a big issue.
It's right, wearing my old hat as a former, art historian, and
Indeed.
someone who trained as a painter at Glasgow School of Art. I come from a visual arts background, and I did work as an art critic for a while, when I was an art historian and teaching art history at GSA. I remember back in those days, actually, the Arts Council, there was an award for art critics going begging. And there wasn't enough applications for it at that time.
When was that?
Well, we're talking back in the sort of 80s.
Yeah. Because now we were looking at that as a golden age.
Well, yes, precisely. But I mean, when you think of it then, the Arts Council couldn't get enough applicants for that at that particular period. I mean, I'm all for strategies as well, because I don't think at the moment, without that strategy, the arts are getting the platform or the promotion that they should be getting here in Scotland. I mean, in the visual arts, again, my own background, I mean, for goodness sake, unless we're a Beck's winner or a Turner Prize nominee or the Venice Biennale or whatever the case may be, no one pays any attention, which is terribly sad, considering the levels beneath that in which we are functioning at a phenomenal level. In the visual arts, this is a world-class arena we have here.
I'm going to be the bad guy here, right? If it's so great, how come people don't go and see it?
Because they don't know about it.
Right.
They genuinely
Absolutely.
don't know.
And which takes us back to Joyce's comment as well about proper reviewing, criticism, and its presence within the press.
But it's also to do with geographical distribution. I mean, again, there's a fantastic spoken word scene that I've just really discovered in the last year because I've been taking part in it. So there are all kinds of little, small-scale activities going on. What there isn't is a platform where people are nationally conscious. But it's not rocket science. It's very easy because we do have the biggest arts festival in the world in Edinburgh, which is the kind of world shop window. We have Celtic Connections, which again, as you say, has been enormously important in providing those. And in some ways, I think geographical and form-based festivals, again, they're all over the place, but a little coordination between them, I think, and this is just throwing my threepence in here, because you can bring more stuff to a much more diverse geographically and socially audience than get hold of it now. By using festivals, and also you can provide continuity of employment for artists, which keeps them in Scotland. And so you take those two things together. So you distribute more stuff more widely, and that employs people for more coherently. That I think, it's not rocket science. It can be done.
I think in terms of what you're talking about letting people know about all this stuff that's going on, I think the key word that you said, Joyce, earlier was transition. We are in a transitional period.
Yes.
And a few years ago there weren't these online platforms, and now there are, but they're not quite there yet. So we are seeing this transition between newspapers and online. And given the richness of what's happening, I feel quite confident that we are going to move to a better place.
I think we can. Sorry, I'm sorry, Alan, but I think we can move to a better place. But I think we need someone to say, okay, all come and talk about this, about how to do this.
Yes. I mean, it's right up until last October, in the 8 years that I was group arts editor at Herald Sunday Herald. In the last couple of years of that, I was holding together those pages and the budgets and everything, but blue tack and sellotape to try and get it to happen. You couldn't pay the freelancers to do things anymore because the budget just kept getting taken away. So what we've got this year, I think, for the first time in history, is people assume that maybe the first thing to go in your arts coverage will be the new band that's coming through and playing King Tut, so we've not got space to cover that. What's happening is that up until now, the Scotsman and the Herald were the papers of record and covered every single concert by the national orchestras, the SCO, the RSNO, Scottish Opera. This year is the first year probably in their history that this has not happened, because the Herald can't keep paying Michael Tumulty to do all the things, and Kate Mollison, and so you're not getting that coverage at the top end either. I think these newspapers should be absolutely covering everything that's on at the Citizens and the Lyceum and the Travers, because they are the newspapers of record. And as soon as those pages go and those freelance budgets go, that doesn't then go somewhere online.
Talking about the online community is patchy. I mean, and people seem to think a crit these days is a tweet. 140 characters cannot sum up what we've got happening. I mean, and you go into blogs, they're just hit and miss. And when we have a kind of arts writers' lunch at the Herald, and for Christmas, I'm always amazed at the knowledge around the table. It's just phenomenal. The interest. Arts writers just don't. They're geeks. They know absolutely everything about their subject, and these people need to be kind of corralled and given the reward. To actually, I don't get any expenses to go anywhere.
Review.
Review. So how does that work? People in Aberdeen think that they get ignored, and I always get this. People say, "Oh, you never do this, you never do that. Great work been going." And I say, "But I don't even get my bus fare."
But taking it back from arts writers to the artists themselves, I do think there is still a dearth of platforms. I mean, it's one thing talking about the major festivals that we have. These act as sort of islands along the kind of calendar year, in which, fantastic as they are, but there's so much more between those islands, in the channels between them, going on week in, week out, that's given no backing, no substance whatsoever.
Are you finding that, Joy? In your world, are you finding it hard to let people know what's happening?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just as we were talking there, I was thinking, we notice a knock-on effect that having less money means there are less reviews. So unless you are at something like Celtic Connections or Plus or part of West End Festival or something, people aren't coming to your gigs. They don't know that they're on. You can't get those gigs reviews. Having less reviewers mean that you're much less likely to get an album review. If you don't have an album review, you don't have a concert review. How do you market yourself? How do you get the word out there? And wonderful as social media is, it's not the be-all and end-all. It's really important to get somebody to endorse what you're doing. And if you cut the funding, from the top down, you see a knock-on effect, definitely.
I have a slightly heretical view, which I don't think it's all to do with media. I think a lot of it is to do with regularity. I think a lot of the regularity of the audience, for example, at the bigger theatres like the Lyceum or at the Sits, is you have to, and for example, the big success story in Scotland in the last 10, 15 years has been the Play a Pound, a Pint or more in terms of theatre. It's on every week. People don't always come every week, but they know it's on.
I'm not sure that gets enough praise for what it's doing.
Extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
But just to take the point a little further, I think if you did have what's wrong with mini festivals? What's wrong with islands? So that people in Tarbert know that for a week every year there's going to be stuff on. And the thing is, you do that everywhere for 1 week, and that gives you the circuit. And it's the same week every year. And okay, we've got August, that's Edinburgh. Mayfest used to happen in May in Glasgow.
Jeez, that was a long time ago.
That's how old we are.
Yeah, I can remember it too.
Yeah, but Mayfest was really important though, as an element of Scottish theatre life, and it was just allowed to go.
Yeah,
like the Arches, just allowed to go.
Well, the Arches wasn't just allowed to go, the Arches was shut.
Yeah.
And the Arches were targeted and closed, and let's not even go there.
Because although there is an enormous amount of activity going on, most of it isn't paid. Most of it doesn't have a big enough audience to sustain itself, except by the enthusiasm of the participants. I mean, the single biggest, as we all know, the single biggest subsidy to the arts is the enthusiasm of the artist.
Yeah.
It always has been.
And maybe that's why you need a cultural strategy, because you need to instill in people's heads that it's not just that cultural identity is part of their national identity, as I think we feel in Scotland more than many other countries. It's about raising the standard, the reputation of artists, so that people don't just go, oh, you sing, can you just turn up your guitar and play something that you
for
respect
nothing.
an artist the same way as you would expect a plumber to come round and get paid to do something.
Sounds like journalism as well.
Perhaps the cultural strategy is just something that is concretely in place to make it that artists can have a proper working life.
It's putting the structure there, because build it and they will come, to paraphrase Field of Dreams.
Do you not think that the independence referendum made a big difference to the way people perceived artists and the status of artists in Scottish society?
Temporarily, yes.
Well, I think it did, but in a strange way, because again, this is to do with age. I was thinking of the 1979 referendum as a defining cultural moment for my generation and for Joyce's generation, because we started at more or less the same time, on different sides of the footlights, as it were. That was a transformative event for the whole culture of the country, culture in the broadest sense, with a small letter at the beginning of it. That defined who we felt we are, and the artists were the ones who, in a sense, carried it forward.
They did. They really did.
I think we all felt kind of part of that. I think the same thing is true of after the independence referendum 2 years ago, that we can't define exactly what it is yet, but I think that something fundamental has changed, and that in a sense, that formula Nicola Sturgeon came up with, that although we voted no, we voted to actually we kept the sovereignty anyway. And I think that sovereignty, that cultural sovereignty, is something to work with. Yes,
The cultural identity question, I think, is interesting, insofar as what role does an artist have in encouraging people to feel that way? Any role at all?
Well, the thing is, you can never either predict. I mean, the glorious thing about the arts is that you can neither predict nor instruct an artist to do good work in a particular area. Artists will define themselves, and they will, define themselves the way Joy defines herself by gloriously singing this Gaelic repertoire, or they'll define themselves by just latching onto some new trend in music that's just come across the Atlantic and doing that brilliantly. Dave Anderson's got a play opening, a little mini musical opening at a play Pie and Pint on Monday, which is tomorrow, I believe, which is called The Day I Found the Blues, which is about the fantastic relationship between the Scottish working class and various strands in American, the people of America's music, if you like. So, artists will define themselves, and I must say, I think whatever strategy we have, it has to be based on the knowledge that we have artists who can really do the work. I mean, there's no doubt that in music, in theatre, in literature, in the visual arts, there is a glorious wealth of talent there. The question is enabling those artists to work to their absolute maximum potential and enabling the people of Scotland to really enjoy that. I mean, I've been through phases in covering Scottish theatre where I honestly felt as if there were cities in Germany where people knew more about new Scottish playwriting than people in Scotland do. And I really don't know why that is. It's a kind of, it's to do with very complex issues to do with media and identity. And the definition of Scotland's identity cannot be anything that any group of politicians or any group of pundits says it should be. It's for the artists to reinvent it constantly going forward, and you have to trust artists to bring tradition and the completely new together in ever evolving ways, and to be both national and internationalist, and they will do that if they're given the right framework.
But I've heard Scottish artists argue that basically don't expect me to do Scottish stuff. I'm bigger than
No,
that. You know,
I
I-
think that's been
not
expected.
it. You know,
What?
I don't. That's the wrong way to look at certainly the funding of it, and I don't think
I'm not
the
talking
funding
about
is
the
done that
funding.
way. But
I'm not talking about the funding. I'm talking about they seem to think it parochial to deal with Scottish issues. Not everybody.
Well,
It's a gross exaggeration, everybody. But you mentioned, Joy, earlier on, you mentioned that, I guess you suggested that there was at one time people were dismissive of certain types of Scottish music. Would that be
Well,
fair?
definitely. And
Why were they, and how did that manifest itself?
well, obviously, I'm coming from a Gaelic perspective,
yeah,
so
yeah.
definitely there was a time where Gaelic citizens were looked down on. It was seen as a language of the poor, and if you wanted to get ahead, you spoke English, and you went out of the Highlands, which were seen as again a poor area. And I think that there was a knock-on effect from the clearances, past then. But now I think that maybe in Scotland in general as a whole, we're a bit more proud to actually say, do you know what we do is good. And actually there's worth in our culture, and be it singing in Gaelic or be it playing music, it doesn't really matter. But actually we see some worth there. And it's really interesting, I think, now when you see bands, big bands that maybe come up to tour Scotland, they don't just now go to Glasgow, they'll tour the Highlands, they'll go to the islands. They like touring up here because it has a great feel to it. They like going out to the islands. Just look at Antopa in Mull, it's a fantastic arts venue, but it's tiny. But you'll get Mumford and Sons going there because they love the reception that they and I think that's really important now, that we look at ourselves as a global contender. And actually what we do is just as good as what everybody else is doing. And we have to be confident in ourselves, actually, to put ourselves on the same platform.
Jan in the visual arts, and I'll bring David around to the visual arts in a minute as well, but Jan, when visual arts, we're huge in the visual arts now.
We're world leaders, really.
It's extraordinary.
If it was football, it would be a different story. We'd be out there.
It would be on the front pages every day.
But we just had GI, Glasgow International, just a couple of months ago in Glasgow, and it's phenomenal. It's bringing artists of the calibre, like the kind of Messi level, to Glasgow, so that people can go and see it and make up their own minds. And they might think this is way too out there for me, because it's GI is not, it's not just painting, it's not just sculpture, it's the full gamut of contemporary art. But we've got it on our doorstep.
As Joyce was saying earlier on, you travel abroad and go to an exhibition opening anywhere in the world, and people there know a lot about what's going on in the visual arts here, because it's on the world stage in that way. We're just not good at pushing that aspect. Although I do despair a little bit, Richard, of that notion that you were talking about this idea that of whenever you hear artists saying, I'm not prepared to take on Scottish issues or whatever the case may be. As Joyce said earlier too, it's not the role of the artist to take on issues. It's the role of the artist to create their own advancement, their own creativity. Some may engage with social issues more readily than others.
They do.
And then in terms of actually a support strategy or whatever financially for them, that's for a decision-making body to make in relation to those artists and how those artists operate. But I hate this idea of any constraints on artists whatsoever.
Well,
that you have some kind of specific social role.
I'm not trying to constrain them, but I'm trying to point them in the direction
Look,
of...
to
pointing artists
no,
in
but
any
to
direction.
address directly what Richard said, of course there are still Scots.
Oh, exactly.
No,
yeah.
of course there are still Scots who have internalised the idea that to be Scottish is to be rubbish, to be... the whole of the No campaign in the referendum was based on playing on people's feeling that a Scotland that was independent would be wee and pathetic and boring and inward-looking and all the rest of it. But nobody who has really worked in the field of Scottish culture over the last 30 years could possibly feel that, because the artists that we're talking about, the festivals that we're talking about, are so much part of the international world. And you have to, in the end, ask yourself, in the kind of world that we live in now, what is a Scottish issue? I mean, if people when Glasgow was the European City of Culture in 1990, of course they were talking about Scottish issues in terms of the end of shipbuilding, what you do with the industrial fabric of a great industrial city once a lot of the industries have gone. But was that a Scottish issue? No. It was an issue for cities like Pittsburgh. It was an issue for cities in the north of France. You know, so as Michel Tremblay, the great Quebec playwright, said, the more you are local, the more you are universal. Now, I'm sure there are artists, probably not the best artists, who are a bit afraid of looking too deeply into their local experience because they do still internalise the idea that it's a bit parochial. But the greatest artists never make that mistake. They use
place,
isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Peter,
Well,
let me ask you a question.
Yeah, sure.
Can I ask you a question?
Aye.
Right, when you set out to write something,
Oh God, yes.
yeah, do you think I have a point to make here? I think this is an injustice, or there's bad stuff happening in it, or this country isn't working in this way.
The answer is sometimes.
Right.
And I mean, if it's a specific piece of work in a specific location, the best thing that ever happened to me in my career was to be told one of my first plays was called White Rose, and I was basically given the cast size, the venue, and the date, and said, okay, but we want it huge. And I thought, well, okay, 40th anniversary, end of the Second World War, it's got to be about the Second World War. So, in other words, you construct something about, to tell a particular story. So we had the Battle of Stalingrad with 3 actors. So, and one of whom was Tilda Swinton, so it's actually one thing. And so it was.
I remember it.
Yes, no, it was. Well, no, so do I. It was quite something. But again, in that way, but also, for example, when you did shows with Wildcat, you started with talking to David Pell and Dave Anderson. You would start by saying, okay, what's on the agenda? What's on the political agenda? And the biggest show that we did, that I did, was with Peter Mullen. We did a show called Harmony Row at the Poll Tax that toured, and basically that Tommy Sheridan and company used as an organising base for the non-payment campaign. And it was an extraordinary experience as well. So the answer is you have to trust the artists. I mean, because people are socially engaged, and if they're not socially engaged, then good luck to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What I don't think you can start doing is saying, okay, is having a point system, by saying we will judge how socially engaged you are, and therefore you get paid or not. But
okay,
again,
right. Well,
yeah.
Okay, if you don't do it that way,
aye.
How do you do it? Because you can't just say, you know what, I'm in charge of funding the arts, and I think that's a really great play you wrote. So here's a bunch of
actually.
and here's a bunch of money.
Well, you can actually. Well, the tricky bit has always been what is the mechanism?
For deciding what's good.
Creative Scotland, which is 2/3 the size of the Arts Council, the Scottish Arts Council, has been put in a role which is completely reactive. So basically, the Creative Scotland are in a situation where things come to them and they say, "Oh, we'll fund that," or "We won't fund that." And sometimes, sometimes very good decisions are taken. Sometimes very quite bizarre decisions are taken. But again, that's the basis of it. Creative Scotland, it's not their fault that if the people get cross with them, but it's because you need. And I think it has to be venue-based, and I think it has to be audience-based. It has to be on getting the most stuff to the biggest audience you can. Very, very simple, and that people will choose, and that if we have a touring circuit, a proper touring circuit for all of the arts, and that people will choose. That goes on, that doesn't, because nobody came. You know. I mean,
So are you saying that you take the decision around this show is going to be popular, people are going to like it, and it's going to go in a tour, therefore the more people are going to get an opportunity to see it, so it gets more money? The
tricky bit is that you don't know until it's on. So therefore you need a way of saying, okay, well I don't know, for example, my last play was about Roger Casement, it was called Roger Casement Hang, it's not the Tron. It was only on for 8 performances. And again, everyone's saying, and it went very well. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily have a future, because you then have to start negotiating with all different kinds of people as to what the future of that thing may be. The funding structures don't exist to take that on. So there are all kinds of nuts and bolts, not really terribly difficult things that you can do. to be able to react to a success.
Joan, what goes through the heads of politicians when they have to think, right, okay, what are we going to... Well, do politicians actually make those decisions? Greater Scotland makes those decisions.
Do not make those
Absolutely
decisions.
not.
Absolutely, they do not make those decisions.
Don't know, they might make a good job of it.
That's why Creative Scotland obviously is that arm's length agency, and that's why we kind of thought long and hard before going down the road of responding by having a cultural strategy, because there has to be that space between politicians and artists. Having said that, to go back to the referendum, I thought some of the best art in Scotland in the last few years came out of the referendum, and it wasn't publicly funded.
No.
You know, like I didn't get the chance to go and see Alan Bissett's play in Edinburgh, but A, because I was too busy campaigning and knocking on doors in Dumfriesshire, but B, because, you know, like it was sold out so quickly.
Yeah.
So clearly, you know, there is an appetite for art that is engaging in Scotland. And I think this summer is going to be crucial, because I think last summer we were, you know, post the Westminster election, there was another debate going on in Scotland, and people were still kind of recovering from the outcome of the referendum. I think this summer people have now thought, right, well, let's go back to 2014 and start where we left off. And I think that applies to politicians, and it applies to artists as well. And I think we're probably entering into another really politically creative period in Scotland now.
And this notion of, you know, engagement, though, you know, I think the...
Over to you.
I really despair, as I say, about this notion of art, you know, to prescription, whether it be in theatre or music or the visual arts or whatever, you know, engage. To some extent, that's up to the audience or the viewer or whatever, as much as anything else. You know, I mean, it was Ernst Fischer, the Marxist art historian, German guy, once said, entertainment doesn't mean silliness any more than serious art means boredom. You know, there are various levels of access there for people, you know, and you can't, you know, do something to prescription, to a template that will appeal to everyone in that way. And the sooner we go over that notion, and that somehow there's a kind of point-scoring exercise, oh, X number of people went to that play, X number of people went to that concert, that gig, X number of people visited that gallery, then we're in a much
But that's
better
the way
place.
things are measured. I mean,
They are, and it's problematic, but I'm just flagging up that we have to be careful
as
about it.
Peter's pointing out, though, at the same time as you have people counting audiences, you don't have much of a strategy for getting work that people have liked, even if it's a small number of people, to a wider audience. So it's like a thing happens, it's assessed, and everybody has to move on to the next piece of new work. I mean, one of the good things about the National Theatre of Scotland, to give it its due, is that it does have the capacity to revive recently successful work, so that and it does do that, and it revives its own work. And I mean, for instance, at the moment, if you want a good night out, and this is a tour which is going into village halls everywhere, you can still see their 2011 show, The Strange Undoing of Prudencia Hart, which happens in pubs and in village halls and in town halls. I saw it in St Andrews Town Hall a couple of weeks ago. Great show, great fun, written by David Gregg, refers back to a Scottish traditional form, which is the Border Ballads, but gives it a complete postmodern twist, and ends up with everybody singing "I Can't Get You Out of Your Head, Out of My Head" by Kylie Minogue. So, you know, it's
should have been a Gaelic song.
No, there's a Gaelic song in it, you know, because Annie Grace is in it, and she sings, and so, you know, it has all of these different cultural strands in it. So, you know, they have the power to keep reviving the successful shows that they've had, but really no other Scottish theatre company has the power to do that. The Tron doesn't have the power to revive Peter's wonderful play, Shall Roger Casement Hang, and that actually answers a lot of your questions in different ways, because that was partly written to a brief, which was that Mayfesto at the Tron, which is their little political festival, was commemorating Easter 1916, so it had to be a play with some angle on the Easter 1916 rising. But at the same time, it was a play that was that seemed to come from somewhere quite deep in terms of the dialogue that Peter imagined between Casement and his interrogator. We went quite deeply into the question of Casement's homosexuality and all of that. And yet, at the same time, it was responding to the debate about what is Britain, what made some people who had been quite strongly involved in the British state as sort of Irish upper middle class people turn to the cause of Irish nationalism, and what does that say about Scottishness? And of course, as it chances, Peter's fictional interrogator is a Scottish British Navy captain. So, you know, there's all of these things going on. Now, is that irrelevant to the current Scottish political situation and our questions of identity now? Of course not. But was it written to some instruction to write about the current Scottish political situation? No.
No.
The Made in Scotland showcases
Yeah.
Fringe, at least is some way of bringing successful productions across theatre, dance, music, whatever, to an audience that...
Yeah, that's
I
true.
mean, I don't think it's particularly designed at a Scottish audience who may have missed it first time round.
No,
It's very
no,
much
no.
that there's a big international audience
Yes.
in town.
It's an international
Let's give them a
showcase,
showcase
yeah.
of what's been over.
It's a brilliant
that kind of thing
brilliant
is
initiative.
really good.
But I think a similar initiative for Made in Scotland, but in Scotland.
Yeah, yeah,
There's an idea.
yeah.
Politicians always never come to a politician with a problem. Come to a politician with an
Yeah.
answer.
No, Made in Scotland
there's
for
a pitch
Scotland
to
would
create
be
a Scotland.
great.
Made in Scotland for Scotland. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah,
Bingo.
yeah. Not instead of the international platform, but both. Absolutely. And also, if people are interested, you get hold of the Little Made in Scotland programme for this year's Edinburgh Fringe. I mean, the range, it covers music and theatre and dance
Yes.
and children's work. And the range of stuff in it, that shows you really what we're talking about in terms of things which are, you know, in terms of the international image of Scotland, there are some things that would reflect that, but there are also things that are just completely about being alive in a 21st century global society, which happen to come from Scotland and have a Scottish voice. And that is wonderful. It's exhilarating to read through that programme because of the sheer range of stuff that's in it.
We could talk about this forever, but one other thing I want to just go, difficult place to go, but I'm going to go there anyway, because there has been a debate about the number of Scottish people who are in charge of Scottish artistic institutions. Most recently, Liz Lockhead raised the question again. Is it relevant what your nationality is when you are applying, or indeed whether you get the job of head of Scottish Galleries or head of National Theatre or any national Scottish Ballet, any national institution? Alan, can you answer that?
Well,
I don't.
I'll tell you.
Logically, can you?
No, I don't. For very many reasons, I think the right person for the job. It doesn't matter your nationality. If you're operating coming from externally, you may then be taking Scotland's exposure up to the international audience that you've been working with before. That helps. I mean, my own career, I went down and worked for 4 years in London in Empire magazine and then came back up here. Did I do the same thing? I went down and benefited my career by being down in London? I don't know. But, no, I mean, I think let's take Scottish Ballet as an example. Now, there's somebody who's a great choreographer himself, with Christopher Hampson doing what he's done there. You look this week at the promotions that have been made with about, 8 or so of the dancers internally within the company who have now stepped up, two of the dancers becoming principals and things like that. That is nurturing people through the ranks. It's keeping that international talent there, and this is something that Christopher's wanting to do. So it's strengthened a national company up here, and his nationality doesn't matter.
Okay.
To that,
We've not got endless amount of time to talk about this, but we have got maybe a comment from each person. Joy, because presumably in your world, if a knowledge of Gaelic is going to be helpful, and you're maybe not going to have that if you come from Germany, maybe, or something.
Well, we definitely have that, but in particular a lot of the organisations, should you be a Gaelic speaker? Obviously if you're in charge of an organisation, which is slightly different in some ways because that's specific knowledge of a language. I mean, I think I'm very much in the same wavelength as you. It's the best person for the job, and actually I wouldn't like a Gaelic speaker to get a job just because they're a Gaelic speaker. I think you need to have somebody who's good at doing what they're doing. Now, as we're working with a minority language and culture, you need an intimate knowledge of how that works. I'm not saying you have to be perfect. You don't have to be this wonderfully eloquent speaker, but you have to understand all the problems, you have to understand the strengths. And actually, if it's somebody who's come from away, who sometimes actually people out with the community are better at seeing the bigger picture. We can be quite narrow-minded, I think, sometimes. So for me, if it was somebody who came in and could do a great job, I would welcome them, definitely.
So, Peter, does that mean in the history of the Edinburgh Festival there's never been a Scot good enough to run it?
Well, no. I think there's one aspect of village life which doesn't get this because taking Scotland as a village. Take as your cue.
It's a metaphor.
Yes, a metaphor. That's a metaphor. But also one of the things about living in a village is that everybody knows you. And I think one of the difficulties about Scots attaining the top jobs in Scotland is everybody knows them and somebody's got something in you. By the time you get to that, level, somebody on that interview panel does your nuts. And that's, you know, and I think that genuinely is an element. But I do think that we can train to run things. I think that's really the key. But also, people, you know, the question will go on, I think.
Dan.
Yeah, no, I mean, in the visual arts, most of the people who are in the top jobs are not Scottish, and I think they all do, you know. You've got John Layton at the National Galleries, who came from the Van Gogh Museum. I mean, he's doing a great job as far as I can see. So, you know, I think they do bring the bigger picture, they bring the kind of the experience, and, you know, and we vice versa. Scots go out and do big jobs all over the world. So I think it all just moves in a big old kind of amorphous blob.
Joyce.
Well, I think there is a certain cringe that's still. I mean, the people who make appointments to the leadership of arts organisations are the boards, and I am quite often struck by the way that the job descriptions that boards draw up don't place enough importance on actually knowing what's going on in Scotland. A bit. You know, I'm not suggesting that all the candidates should come from inside Scotland, far from it. But I think if you have no knowledge of Scotland at all, you're really going to be wasting your first 2 or 3 years in a major cultural job in Scotland actually learning what the heck's going on. And I think that's a waste of everyone's money. And I think it is a pure failure on the part of the people who are drawing up the job descriptions to give sufficient status to knowledge of the Scottish scene. And heaven knows it is worth knowing about in all the art forms that we've talked about. So in that sense, I think, you know, we could be more demanding of the whole run of candidates in terms of what they know about Scotland. I mean, I won't tell you which grandee appointed recently to, this was who had at that time been recently appointed to a cultural job is no longer in Scotland, to whom I had to explain that Aberdeen was north of Dundee. I don't really think that's acceptable. You know, and it seems to me that you know, that kind of thing should be avoided. But having said that, if you look at the classic example in theatre of Vicky Featherstone, who came here from Payne's Plough and from London to be the founding director of the National Theatre of Scotland, what she brought was a great respect for the current generation of Scottish playwriting, because she had worked with many Scottish playwrights before she got the job, which is a very important creative pulse in Scottish theatre. And then on top of that, she brought an openness to every kind of narrative and story about Scotland, which maybe somebody who came from just one of those Scottish areas or one of those strands of Scottish life would have struggled to get that kind of really sweeping overview that she had, and that commitment to making the National Theatre of Scotland cover the whole geographical spread of the country. So as a founding director of the National Theatre of Scotland, she could hardly have been improved on, and I certainly can't think of a Scottish candidate that would have been any better, which is not to say that there could never be a Scot who could be a brilliant director of the National Theatre of Scotland. I can think of a few right now who should be applying to replace Laurie Sansom when he goes.
Joan, very quickly.
I would agree with Joyce. I think it's got to be the best person for the job, but they do have to understand and have a knowledge of Scottish culture. And I think in fairness to Liz and to other people like Jim Kelman, who have made similar points in the past, there have been people who have come and with the best will in the world are excellent people, absolutely excellent at what they do, but they are in the process of discovering Scottish culture in the job, and then they're kind of reintroducing it to us, and that's a point that they've made. And I think one of Liz's criticisms, and if you take her comments more widely, is that some of her work and that canon of Scottish work has not been performed by some of our national companies, and it's then lost. And I think, why is that? You know, I think that's something that we have to address going forward. It doesn't necessarily pertain to the nationality of the people, but I think we have a huge canon of Scottish work that Scottish people need to know about, and I would like to see the people in charge of our important cultural institutions doing that.
David.
I mean, I like to think of myself as a Scot and an internationalist in respectively, and you know, I'm not, as I say, for any restrictions being imposed neither on artists nor indeed, you know, horses for courses in terms of jobs, be it creative, aesthetic, you know, geographical, or whatever the case may be, with the obvious caveats that they've got to know the culture they're stepping into, they've got to understand the sort of dynamics, mechanisms, and what makes it breathe and tick. Obviously, provided they have that, I'm fine, wherever they come from.
Good. Okay, well, I'd like to thank all our guests today. That was a great discussion. Thank you very much. I've got to make one announcement about a programme that we are doing in Bathgate. It's called EU Answers. It's produced by Broadcasting Scotland in collaboration with Regal Radio and Regal Community Theatre, which is the venue for it. It's an EU debate, and on the, need to be careful I get the right sides here, on the Remain side is Fiona Hislop, who's the MSP and the Culture Secretary, and Bonnie Sandling from Stronger in Scotland. In the Leave side, we've got Richard Simpson, who's Tory MSP for Central Scotland, and a soon-to-be announced other person.
Hot off the presses by powers of telepathy, I've just been told, Braden Day, Assistant Director of the Scottish Vote Leave campaign, will be the fourth panel member.
That's incredible. We've had that confirmed while we've been on here.
Absolutely.
It's going to be chaired by Mr. Pratt here, so it should be a very good programme. Look forward to that very much. Again, the date is sometime 13th of June, 8 p.m. So hope you can tune in for that. Again, thank you very much to all our guests. We're going to leave the programme now with a final song from Joy. Can you tell us a bit about this song?
Well, I thought that since we've had such a lively debate, it would be good to finish off with a wee bit of Gaelic Push to Beal, and this is our mouth music for dancing, so you never know, might want
it's not going to happen around here.
Encourage Mr. Walker to dance as well as sing.
No. Joy.
What